Hello, this is Steve Buoniconti from SOA Consulting Services. Continuing our Angular 4 tutorial series, today we're going to talk about forms. What I'll do is I'll give you a brief introduction to forms, and then we'll talk about template-driven forms. I'll follow that with a tutorial on reactive forms. Okay, so in Angular 4 there's two types of forms. There's a template-driven form, which is fully programmed in the components template. The template defines the structure of the form, template defines the format of its fields, and template defines the validation rules. Loosely speaking, you create HTML with Angular 4 directives, and you view that template as submitting, let's say, a JSON object to the backend component for processing. So it has its own directives and has its own backend objects. Reactive forms has a form model created programmatically in the code, typically using TypeScript. And a template can be statically defined and bound to existing model or dynamically generated based on the model. So in this particular API, you're modeling the form model in the backend component, and then what you're doing in the template is you're creating a template which maps some of those attributes or all of those attributes to the backend form model. Each type of form has its own API, directives, and TypeScript classes. I'm going to say at a surface, they each have their own TypeScript classes. Okay, so both form types have a model that stores the form data. The model uses Angular Forms module, FormControl, FormGroup, and FormArray. The template-driven has directives to tell Angular how to implicitly create the form. It's simpler and implicitly uses forms model classes. The form is exported as a JSON value, let's say passed to the submit method, and directives are used for validation. Although it's simpler, it's nice to use because you're always in the markup fragments defining the form attributes, and a JSON value goes to the back end, so you log it, you implement functionality based on the JSON object. There's not many code changes except in the component. In the reactive model, you create the model explicitly and then link the HTML template elements to the model. Okay, the benefits of this is you can test it without a browser. It handles much more complex scenarios, enables you to explicitly use observables, hence it's much more reactive. And functions are used for validation. You could develop more powerful validation functions. And you explicitly use form model classes. Okay, so in the reactive model, much more powerful, much more programming goes on, much more reactive user interface, because you have the concept of observables, and as the user is typing, you're streaming characters to the back end. So take a look at both of them, see what you like, but I pretty much focus on the reactive aspects of programming because most of the production applications are very complex and you need that complex model. Okay, so in the template-driven forms, you import a forms module. In the reactive programming, you import the reactive forms module. Or you could just import both modules and do whatever you need to do. And of course, in the NgModel annotation, you have to import those models you're using in your component model. I'm going to say in your app model. Okay, so let's dive into template-driven forms. Okay, template-driven forms must use directives from the Forms module. There's an NgForm, which represents the entire form. It is an auto attached to every form and implicitly creates an instance of the FormGroup class that represents the model and stores the form data. You have an NgModel, which represents a single field on a form and marks the HTML element to be part of the form model. It implicitly creates an instance of FormControl. And you have an NgModelGroup, which represents part of the form and allows you to group the fields together, implicitly creates the instance of the form group. And it creates a nested object in the NgForm.value. Okay, so keep in mind here, I'm listing these directives, but the directives are automatically creating these instances, and it's a simpler way to program, because a lot of stuff is being done implicitly for you with the template-driven forms. The NgForm automatically attached to the form elements discovers all child HTML elements marked with the NgModel directive and adds their values to the form model. NgForm directive has selectors. There's an attribute selector, an element selector, and an exclude processing. It also has an export as property declared on its directive annotation, which allows you to use this property to create a local variable to reference the instance of NgForm. For example, if I had form hashtag F equals NgForm, then what I'm stating here in Angular is I want F to represent the value object of the form. And so I could actually list the value object of the form. One difference here, I believe, in this template, F has the object, which isn't necessarily bound to the backend object. It's bound to the template. So f.value is only seen in the template. Okay, say NgForm Submit. NgForm intercepts the standard HTML form submit event and prevents automatic form submission. It instead submits a custom submit event. So notice in this particular statement, you got the export as notation. F is the form object. NgForm is the binding to the backend object, but in this case here, it's just really binding to the form data on the template. The event NgSubmit is caught using this syntax with the left paren, right paren, and it invokes the onSubmit function, and it passes f.value, which is the JSON value of the NgForm. The NgModel is an attribute attaches to the FormControl object to HTML. So basically, when you look at this input tag, it is attaching a form control object to the HTML. So you add to the model by adding this NgModel attribute. And the name is required, the username is required, because then that'll map the field to username. So if you were to look at the previous example, f.username would have the value of this form, or let's say this input field. Another example is, suppose you had a form with an input, the type was text, the name was username, you had NgModel, and you had $C equals NgModel. You can show the C.value of in the template. That would be the current value of the form. Another example here would be C.value.username, and you'd be able to show the username. Notice the NgModel once again adds to the model. The export as NgModel puts the form in a temporary variable C. I think what we're trying to demonstrate here is a control going into the value C. So in this case here, it should show the username. But in a more complex scenario, you'd see C.value.username if you had, let's say, an embedded object or something. NgModelGroup groups form fields together and implicitly creates an instance of FormGroup class. It creates a nested object in the object stored in NgForm.value. Okay, so here's an example. We have a form value name. And then we have a nested object property name. By using NgModelGroup, I'm saying I'm going to categorize the first name and last name with this NgModelGroup full name. Now F can be you can render the attributes of the F object in the template by doing the notation f.fullname.firstname, f.fullname.lastname. F.value should show everything including that full name object. You would see an embedded full name object in the JSON object. Okay, now validating template-driven forms. Directives are all you can use to validate template-driven forms. You wrap validate functions into directives to use them in the template. So suppose we had a directive with a selector SSN. We define a selector as an HTML attribute by using the square bracket notation here. We use these providers, NG validators. We use a value, SSN validator. And we define multi to be true, which means I could have multiple validators. So register SSN validator as an NG_validators provider. And then we write a class that says SSN validator directive. And once we do that, we could then use the SSN attribute on the control form. So this input markup will say I have a name SSN SS number. It's part of my model, and this is my validator. So what will happen is the SSN selector is used to point to the SSN validator, and that validator is used to validate my number. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of examples. The first one will be a forms template-driven example. And then we'll take a look at a forms template-driven submit function, where we're submitting data to the back end. And then we'll look at some template-driven validation examples. Stay tuned for the next tutorial.